Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Across State Lines. I'm your host, Danielle. Thank you so much for tuning back into the podcast for episode 18, where today we will be discussing the 1980 disappearance of Paul Braxton Fugate. In 1980, Paul was a park ranger at the Chiricahua National Monument, which is made up of pinnacles, spires, and balanced rocks that were formed after a volcano 270 million years ago. One day, Paul went to the visitor center to let another employee know that he would be making a patrol to a nearby area. But as night fell, he never returned. A large-scale search was put on for Paul, which lasted weeks, and personal searches by his wife that lasted years. But Paul has never been located. While at first glance, it might appear that Paul simply got lost and never resurfaced. But his disappearance led to many theories about murder when it was reported that he was last seen in the presence of two men in a pickup truck. And many suspects came to light after fingers were pointed in every which direction. And two unsigned letters arrived in the mail naming two suspects who have since died. But before we jump into the case, I just want to say a quick thank you to everybody who has subscribed to the podcast. And I'm so excited to say that I have reached 200 subscribers on YouTube over the last month since I began. When I first started this podcast, I never really thought it would take off and many people would be listening. It was more of a personal creative project that I thought I'd try out when my daughter told me that she would like me to turn my true crime articles into listening form so she could listen while she did homework. But so many of you have listened, downloaded, and subscribed, and I just want to say how truly grateful I am. So thank you so much, and I'm excited to keep going and putting out twice weekly episodes for you to enjoy. Just as a reminder, Across State Lines is available on all listening platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere else you might listen. If you are liking Across State Lines and are willing to leave us a rating or a review, it would be greatly appreciated. If you want to leave us any feedback, go to our website and send us an email. Thank you so much for listening. And now, let's dive into the strange disappearance of Paul Braxton Fugate. Paul Braxton Fugate was born in Brooklyn, New York on September 2nd, 1938. He was the oldest of 6 children, the first of 3 sons and 3 daughters. Once World War II began, the family decided to move and settle into their parents' hometown in Fort Worth, Texas. As a teenager, Paul enjoyed gardening, growing large castor beans specifically, and at one point, he had befriended and tamed a crow. As he got older, he began to rebel against his parents' strict upbringing, searching for and finding his own values and beliefs. He fought for those beliefs by acting on them, such as protesting the Vietnam War and refusing to sign a loyalty oath in college. Instead of joining the services in the Vietnam War, Paul began college in order to obtain a biology degree. He enjoyed smoking a joint here and there despite the laws of the time, and Paul was forging his own way and finding himself as he grew older, and he liked who he was becoming. Paul met Dottie, his eventual wife, in his own home in 1962. Dottie was over the home spending time with Paul's sisters, who she knew from being in Girl Scouts together when she first saw him. It was then and there that she said she was going to marry Paul. One of his sisters laughed and said, "Don't do that, he's weird." But Dottie was right. She and Paul wed on December 11th, 1964. Before their marriage, Paul had decided to apply to the National Park Service, becoming a ranger. 5 months after their marriage, Paul had to head to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico to begin his new career he had long awaited for. Here, he fell in love with his job, enthralling visitors with his nightly sunset talks, extensively curated plant lists, and knowledge of the park. Next, the Fugates traveled together to where Paul would be stationed at the Navajo National Monument in Arizona. Paul loved the location of his new job and entertaining the visitors of the park, but he couldn't stand his new boss, Jack Williams. He and another employee would shoot glass bottles with their rifles, and joke about sending Jack off the edge of a cliff on a horse. But this hatred was definitely mutual, as Jack equally had a strong dislike for Paul as well. A letter written by Jack in 1967, he scolded Paul for being anti-authoritarian, lazy, and chastised him about his personal appearance. He wrote, quote, "If you want to look and live like a hippie, that is certainly your prerogative, but not here at the Navajo National Monument." End quote. Jack wrote another letter to his regional director stating, quote, "I do not understand the breed now coming into the NPS." End quote. This letter prompted the Park Service to relocate Paul to the Chiricahuas, still within the state of Arizona, just to the east of Tucson. Once in the Chiricahuas, Dottie and Paul's marriage shifted to an open marriage. However, this open relationship wasn't for both partners. This was seemingly only for Paul, and Dottie required that these relationships only be sexual in nature, and nothing emotional or romantic between him and any future partners he may have. Dottie wanted his spiritual commitment above all else. His first girlfriend was a 19-year-old named Becky who worked as a park aide. Becky stated to a news source that she recalls Dottie getting very angry when her and Paul would discuss emotional topics, and she reminded Paul of the rules of their open marriage. Once Paul started meeting women, he began to change his appearance, now growing a large handlebar mustache. This type of facial hair was against the Park Service's guidelines, however, and he would be subsequently fired. The NPS also cited his, quote, "negative personal attitude and abuse of government property" as additional reasons for his termination. He had previously been accused of stealing hay from the park to feed Dottie's horse. The couple moved to Tucson after his termination, where Paul hired a lawyer named Edward Morgan. The pair spent 5 long years in a legal battle with the Park Service in order to get his job back, and he succeeded in doing so. In 1976, to the dismay of the Park Service lawyers, Paul's former job at the Chiricahuas was reinstated. He was awarded back pay, which was thousands of dollars. During his time when he had been terminated from the park, Paul began taking classes at the University of Arizona, where he had made a great impression on the botany department of the school. One of Paul's supervisors called Paul one of the finest men he has ever had pleasure to work with, and among the top 10 students the department has seen in the past 25 years. In fact, Paul made such an impression on the department that after he went missing, a classmate named a new plant species after him in his memory, called Amsonia fugate. Dottie rarely came up to the monument 2 hours away to visit Paul, and instead stayed in their Tucson home. Paul, however, occasionally made his way back home, but spent most of his time on location at the park. In his spare time, Paul loved to mess with his 1955 Chevy sedan, track javelina, search the desert to see which wildflowers were in bloom, and occasionally get stoned with other employees and do moonlit walks with a local guru. He loved his job, but his neighbor described him as a lost soul and too intelligent to be there. In March of 1978, Paul met a woman whose name is unknown but frequently is referred to as Bonnie, so that's what we'll call her here. As a side note, Bonnie was suspecting that she was pregnant a few days after Paul disappeared, but was furious to learn after Paul's disappearance through Dottie that Paul did not have a vasectomy like he had promised her. It turns out that Bonnie was indeed pregnant in the end, and once Paul never returned home, she decided it was in her best interest to terminate the pregnancy. Paul was one of only 2 park employees on duty on January 13th, 1980. Due to it being the off-season, only 2 people were on staff at the time, with the other employee there being a seasonal employee working as a clerk. At 2 p.m. that day, he told the other employee that he was going to do a foot patrol of a nearby trail after he and Bonnie had done a hike within the canyon and he brought her back to the visitor center. He let the clerk know that if he wasn't back at the visitor center by 4:30 p.m., to go ahead and shut the place down for the day. Paul left the visitor center, leaving behind his radio and only taking his keys. When Paul didn't return home to Bonnie that evening, she began to worry. She made a call to the police, as well as the Park Service, and an extensive search for Paul began immediately. The area Paul was intending to be patrolling wasn't large. It was an 8-mile hike one way, coming to a dead end at the 8th mile. Paul should have been along this route according to what he claimed before he left. But the area is 12,000 acres of rugged terrain, with cliffs, canyons, and arroyos. Plenty of places to end up lost if you wander off trail. It was initially believed that Paul had simply walked away on his own, with some stating he left a failing career, an unstable marriage, and a pregnant girlfriend. The next day, the park contacted the Cochise County Sheriff's Office, who began a large-scale search of the area, which totaled 22 people searching on foot and one dog. When this failed to produce any sign of Paul, the next day they brought in a helicopter to look for him from above, along with the Southern Arizona Rescue Mission team searching once again on foot, with some searchers rappelling the typically impassable Organ Pipe Formation. At one point, searchers became excited when they found footprints in the dirt, believing that they came from Paul. However, it was soon determined that the footprints came from another searcher, and that excitement quickly flattened. Employing every form of help that they could, the park even brought in the Boy Scouts, who teamed up with their troop leaders and searched a mile around the visitor center. Sadly, Paul couldn't be located, and hopes began to dwindle of finding him. The official search lasted for 2 long weeks, but when they decided to call the search quits, assuming that Paul was no longer alive, that didn't stop Dottie from continuing on. In fact, Dottie searched for years with volunteers to try to locate her missing husband. Rumors began to circulate about what might have happened to Paul, and the theory that Paul had come across something he was not meant to see while on his foot patrol began to emerge. Some park employees stated that they had seen tire spin-out tracks in the dirt on a primitive road near the fairway, as well as indications of a struggle in the dirt. I can't say what that means exactly, whether there were items in the area to point to a struggle, or if the dirt was disturbed as if 2 people had fought. This theory also gained traction when Dottie brought in a clairvoyant, hoping for any help with the case of her missing husband. This clairvoyant, Sandy Brooks, had some interesting things to say. She claimed that she immediately sensed a time portal in a nearby home, and that she had a vision of 2 men who were standing over a drugged and unconscious body of a woman. And when Paul stumbled upon these men, they shoved a drug down his throat, killed him, and dropped his body across the border in Mexico. Hearing this, Dottie was extremely rattled, as she herself claimed that she had seen some sketchy people around the fairway in her times visiting, and wondered if the clairvoyant's vision had any credibility. Investigators had claimed that Paul was nowhere within the 80 square miles of the park, which led to another potential theory brought forth by a lead detective, who stated that he believed Paul may have become the victim of a drug deal gone wrong. He stated that since the area was in close proximity to the Mexican border, and since in this time drugs were beginning to cross the border into America, that he believed Paul had been murdered when he either saw something he shouldn't have or was part of some illicit drug deal. Soon, another park employee named Dick Horton came forward to say that he and his wife had seen Paul that day around 4 p.m. He said that Paul was sitting inside of a pickup truck, slumped over, and sitting in between 2 men. The pickup truck was driving at a high rate of speed away from the monument. The police were hoping to get more information out of Horton, so they decided to put him under hypnosis in a nearby motel. During this, the park employee claimed that Paul had looked sad and dejected, and this memory upset Horton so much that he began to cry as he recalled it. He recalls the appearance of the 2 men. One man was wearing a green jacket, possibly Paul's park ranger jacket, and the other wore a red, black, and white plaid shirt and sported a Kenny Rogers-style beard. Both men appeared to be in their 30s and were driving a dark green pickup truck with a camper shell. Police began to wonder if this was the same vehicle that had made the tire impressions stated by the other employees. In October of 1980, a letter came into the lead detective, postmarked from Bloomington, Illinois. In block print lettering, the letter said, "Ask Ernest Goff in the county jail in Phoenix about Mr. Fugate." A year later, another letter came in through the mail stating that a Ted Carpenter was the one who killed Paul. Both named men had ongoing legal issues in Arizona, with Goff recently being acquitted for a high-profile prison murder, and the two men had also stolen a pickup truck at the airport weeks after Paul disappeared, running it into an orange tree. Carpenter was called in for a polygraph, but he had bailed after the 3-hour pre-polygraph interview. During this interview, he stated that he had seen Goff and another unknown man shoot Paul and had helped bury him south of Tucson, in a wash in Santa Cruz County. Police believe that Carpenter would tell them anything. He ended up doing a polygraph the following week, but recanted the entire story. It's unknown whether he passed or failed this polygraph, however. Interviewing Carpenter the following year, he told investigators that he may know something about the death of Fugate, but will only speak if they offer him some kind of deal. Unfortunately, both Goff and Carpenter have since died. In 1982, another lead came in about a man named David. David had worked in an auto shop in Tucson at the time of Paul's disappearance, and he had reportedly bragged about shooting a Border Patrol officer and being at the place where Cochise is buried. The lead investigator flew to Wisconsin to speak to David, where David claimed he was just a bullshitter and he had been talking bullshit at a party to puff himself up. David agreed to a polygraph test, but claims the night before that he was so nervous he popped a few sleeping pills, and that's what caused his failure of the polygraph the following morning. The investigator wanted to charge David with Paul's death, but with lack of evidence, he wasn't able to. The same investigator believed strongly that if David didn't participate in what happened to Paul, he surely does know what happened to him. He was never charged, and when his name leaked to the media, David became very reclusive. Despite all of this, in February of 1981, the Park Service went on to officially terminate Paul Fugate from his job. Not only this, but the Park Service was also demanding $6,925 that they had paid out to his wife Dottie during the time that Paul was missing. The National Park Service chief says that he believes Paul is still alive, quote, living with a paramour somewhere, very healthy. The National Park Service refused to have Paul listed as legally dead, making Dottie unable to claim her husband's survivor benefits or pension. 5 years passed, and in 1986, with a National Park Service investigator and an Arizona Department of Public Safety investigator working together, it was determined that Paul Fugate most likely had not walked away on his own that day in 1980, and that he may have either gotten lost in the wilderness or foul play had occurred. With this determination, Dottie's application for benefits was finally approved. There has been no sightings or trace of Paul Braxton Fugate since that cold January afternoon in 1980. Speculation and rumors abound to what may have happened to him, but in the last 44 years, his body has never been recovered nor stumbled upon in the Chiricahua National Park. Was Paul the victim of foul play, perhaps one of the few people who he had personal issues with? There were a few of them. Jack Williams had a lot of disdain for Paul. Bonnie was lied to by Paul about his vasectomy, and Dottie was forced to live with his infidelity. Any one of these people had motive, but in the end, it could be as simple as Paul getting lost or disorientated on his footpath and succumbing to the elements. When last seen, Paul Fugate was described as standing anywhere between 5'5" and 5'10", weighing 160 to 170 pounds. He was wearing a gray National Park Service uniform shirt with patches and a badge, a bright green National Park Service uniform jacket with red lining, jockey shorts, white socks, and green work boots. He's described as a Caucasian male with graying-brown hair and blue eyes. Paul's hair was long at the time of his disappearance, and he had a full beard and mustache and a pronounced widow's peak. At the time of his disappearance, he also wore thick eyeglasses. It's a long shot as it's been so many years, but if you have any information about Paul Fugate's disappearance, please call the Cochise County Sheriff's Department at 520-803-3280. Thank you so much for listening to Across State Lines, and we will be back next week to dive into another unsolved case. Please follow or subscribe to Across State Lines on your podcast listening platform so that way new episodes will drop directly into your listening feed. If you'd like to rate or review Across State Lines on whatever platform you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and join us again next week.